So let me show you what I mean. Now we're going to go through this in detail, but I have to give you a little bit of theory here just to give you the main crux of the argument, and then we'll get into to each step in more detail if you would like to. I'll go into, you could follow along if you want to in later presentations. But don't worry about the numbers here at this point in time. I'm just going to say there's 12 notes. 12 notes in our musical alphabet. And what do we do with a scale? We typically first think about the C major scale, and we use a formula picking some of those notes. Now you might ask why that formula seems arbitrary. We can get into why the formula works. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but right now I'm just going to accept a priori in Western music. I'm going to accept as just the way it is that we use this formula to take 7 of those 12 notes. So if I list those, we can call that a scale. If we start from the C, we call that a C major scale. So these 7 notes in this order is the C major scale. If I label the relative positions of the C major scale, the C here would be a 1, the D would be 2, the E would be 3. It would just be in order from top to bottom. Don't worry about these numbers. Those are the numbers of the notes. Just imagine we have a numbering system from top to bottom, 1 through 7. That would be the scale. However, if I moved and I said, well, now I want to have the scale be the D, that's my tonic now. What do? Well, we just renumber it. We say that's now the 1. So we just have a relative numbering system, same 7 notes, but now this is the 1, and I say 1, 2, 3, 4 through 7. What if I want to have the E as the tonic? Well, then we just start at the E and say that's the 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, so remember the 3 ways that we can kind of try to memorize the fretboard. I can try to memorize the fretboard by all 12 notes on the fretboard, but that's not really going to help me to play in a diatonic key, whether it be C major, Dorian, Phrygian, right? Because it's not going to tell me which notes fit in a particular shape. What I want to do, then the other way I can learn is by note. So I could learn all of the notes in the C major and related modes, the diatonic notes in C major. That would allow me to play not only C major, but I can see the shape and play around any of the other notes in there. So that's actually more flexible to play within a particular key. However, it will not allow me to shift from playing from C major and related modes to say D. Like if I wanted to play in the key of B and the related diatonic modes, then learning the notes of the C major won't be transferable. I can't copy and paste them up. So what can I do instead? I could learn the relative nodal positions. I'm not going to name this note as a C when I look at it on the fretboard. That's not the primary way I see it. I'm not going to see it as relative position number 1, but rather I'm going to see it as the node, the Ionian node. If I see the Ionian node, that doesn't change. If I see the Dorian node, that doesn't change. Now, don't let the terminology mess you up, because when we look at modes, you might think of a mode as a scale, right? And it is, you can think of it as a scale, but you can also think of it as the point. It's usually what we renumber to be the 1, and then we count from there to get the modal scale. So we'll talk more about that later. The point I want to talk about now is just that the way you want to memorize the fretboard to make it as flexible as possible, as maneuverable as possible, is to not memorize the notes. That's not where you spend most of your time. To not memorize relative positions and scale positions. That's not where you maximize your time. But to memorize the nodal points, because that's completely maneuverable within the diatonic modes as well as across scales. Let me show you what I mean. Here's a fretboard. I have the top or heavy E string on top. That's how I do the fretboards, because I think it maps onto actually what you see from your perspective of the guitar. So this is the low or heavy E string, the one closest to the ceiling, and on down. So what I want to point out here is that everything that has something in it is one of these 7 notes. The ones that are blank are representing the frets on the fretboard that are the 5 notes that aren't in our scale. So in theory, if I just memorized this shape, now I know it's a little complex to memorize it across the entire fretboard, which we typically break the fretboard in the guitar into like 5 shapes, or you can think of it, 3-note per string, whatever. We'll talk about that later. But the idea would be, if you memorize this one shape across the guitar, then you can play within diatonic scale if you just don't hit any of the blank notes. And you should be playing something that sounds diatonically good. It's in the same basic key. That's going to be the general idea. Okay, so let's look at our 3 ways for memorizing the fretboard then. What if I memorize the fretboard by note? Here's a C. Well, here's a C right here. Now, if I memorize the note that is a C note, then obviously the C notes will always be the same on the fretboard. And so if I'm playing in C major and relative modes, that works actually quite well, right? Because I can say, okay, I know where the C is. If I move to the Dorian, let's say I make the Dorian the 1, I want to be playing around this Dorian mode, or the Aeolian, which is the minor scale. What if I want to play in the minor scale? Well, if I play in the minor scale, here's the A is the relative minor. So the C doesn't change. So it's not like the C changed. So if I learn the notes, that actually works well for me to be able to play within any of the modes because I've memorized all the notes. Where doesn't it work? It doesn't work if I want to transfer it to another key. So if I learned all the notes in C major and related modes, but then I want to play in the key of D, for example, you can see what happens here is this shape shifted up, right? So it's the same shape here as here. You can see the relative positions up here, boom, 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 and then doot, here, dut, 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 dut. But the notes are different. So this note, I learned it as C here. It's not going to be C anymore because now it's a D because I'm playing in D major. So if I learn the notes then that are in a particular key, like C major, that works for me to maneuver through the 7 modes, but it doesn't work for me to copy and paste, to shift up through the 12 different positions. All right, what's my other option? My other option is that I could learn the relative position, meaning if I'm in C major, I can play the relative position, that's the 1, and this A over here is the 6 of that scale. Okay, so that actually works well if I shift to a different key. So if I go to D, then I can still say, well, look, that's relative position 1 here, which makes sense. 6 represents the 6th position relative to the C major scale. In other words, if we just number the scale, we have 1 as C, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This A note represents the 6th of the C major scale. Now that works beautifully as we move to the D major scale. If we constructed the D major scale, the 6th position would then be the B note, which is still having the same relative position within the shape. So therefore, if we learn the relative positions, that works great as we kind of copy and paste up the fretboard, as we go from playing in a C major and related diatonic modes to playing in like a D major and related diatonic modes, or D sharp major and related diatonic modes, and so on and so forth. However, it breaks down when you're playing within the modes of the same diatonic system. In other words, if I have to change the numbering system as I make the D the tonic, that means I have to memorize the same fretboard with a different numbering system. So in other words, let's say that we're playing in the related A minor, which is the related minor scale position to the C major, which you can also call the Aeolian mode. Well, that would mean that this would now have to be called scale position 1 instead of scale position 6. So that means even though the entire shape is the same, I'm remembering a different numbering system as I go through the different modes, which also means, because that's how we construct chords, that whenever I go from one chord to another, I'm basically visualizing as though I'm playing in a completely different scale, when in actuality I'm playing within the same shape. So what would be a better system to do? What would give you the most flexibility to move through the fretboard? It would be to learn the relative node, what I'm calling node positions, which you can call the modes. So the modes are a little bit confusing. Most people are intimidated by them because of the names, the Greek names that are assigned to them. But later we'll apply a numbering system to them. You also might get confused because the modes sound like a scale. If I say that something is a mode, I think it's a set of 7 notes. But we can think of it as the starting point, right? A point within this system. Each of these are going to be a point, a node within a system. And if I memorize all of the nodes, if I memorize that relative position, not as the C note, because that's not transferable as I go through different scales, or as a relative position, because that's not transferable as I go through the modes, but rather as the nodal point of the Ionian, notice that is going to be the same even if I change. If I go to the Dorian mode, if I play in the Dorian scale, I'm not going to change the fact that that's still the node of Ionian node. It's still the Ionian node, right? If I go to Mixolydian, if I go to the related minor scale, then I'm not going to then change I'm going to apply a numbering system to it later, but I'm not going to stop calling this the Aeolian node. The Aeolian node is still there. So that means that I can learn this one shape, which applies out to all the diatonic nodes. I can play through all the diatonic nodes, just changing the center point that I'm playing around using the same master shape. And if I move to a different diatonic set of notes, meaning D major, for example, and all the related notes to them, you can see it copies and pastes beautifully as well. So now we can see that the I represents the Ionian mode. So that node now has changed. It's a different note name, but it's the same relative position within the shape. And same over here. This A is a different, is representing the Aeolian node. So if you learn the node positions, that means you just have to learn one master shape. And that one master shape includes all of the 7 modes within it. You're just shifting the nodal points within it. And you can copy and paste that shape up and down to the 12 diatonic scales up and down the fretboard. I think that is unquestionably, from just a learning perspective, to try to unlock the fretboard as fast as possible and as efficiently as possible, the way to go, right? Of the 3 things that you can kind of really start off and focus your time learning, I don't think it should be the notes themselves. I don't think it should be the relative scale positions. I think it should be the nodes, the relative nodal points. And by doing that, you can practice not by starting in the major and minor scale and then branching out to the other modes. You can practice all of the modes at the same time because you're just shifting modal center points. So, and historically, by the way, we'll get into this later, they kind of got this idea that the major scale and the minor scale were the things that they wanted to play in all the time. So the other modes kind of took a back seat. But I don't think that's the case these days. I think most people would say, hey, look, I would like to treat all the modes the same, and because they are all part of the same kind of network, and be able to shift through the modes as I want to be going through the different modes. We'll talk more about that later. But that's my argument, that I think that's going to be the fastest way to go. Now, the same argument applies to the piano, although the piano is a little bit different. I'll touch on that